Hey everyone, my name is Eric, and in this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at how to create clouds. Now, we've taken a look at how to create clouds in the past, more specifically using the painting with polygons method. That technique may not be ideal for the type of clouds you're trying to create or the render times that you're stuck with. This technique is actually something that originated back with video games. Video games for a very long time have been faking gaseous materials, gaseous, phenomena using single planes that have nice transparent textures on it. Then with multiple planes scattered throughout an environment, you can build up this illusion of volume and this illusion of a gaseous phenomena. Now, we're going to be using the similar principle here. And the pipeline that we're going to be following was something that actually Damien Nenow presented at SIGGRAPH just recently. And so we're going to be deviating from his pipeline just a little bit, but it's pretty much right in line with what he was doing. One of the major differences is that we are not going to be using a modifier, a custom modifier that you need to download from the web. Instead, we're going to be using V-Ray for the majority of our process. And through that, we will get very accurate translucency, which is a very important part of capturing the look and feel of clouds, because clouds absorb light, they scatter the light, and that is something that V-Ray does very well. Now, the technique that we're doing here, though, can be done in the scanline renderer, Mental Ray, Maxwell, obviously V-Ray, Brazil, whatever the case may be. Basically, any renderer that will render the lighting of your scene into a texture can be used with this method. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get started with the actual creation of our cloud shape. Now, this entire technique originates from geometry, some cloud-ish shape. So we're going to create a bunch of spheres that kind of represent what we want our cloud to look like. So if we go over to create, geometry, standard primitives, sphere. And then from within here, we'll make a big one, smaller one, and then a smaller one still. I'm just going to adjust them so they intersect one another. Okay, so something like this. Now from here, we're going to start to attach these objects together. Now, before I go any further, there are a few assumptions to those watching this video. I'm assuming that you know the basics of 3D Studio Max: viewports, primitives, materials, lights. I will be, when we get into the more specific elements of this technique, I will go slower. I will explain everything in a little bit more detail. However, not a lot of time is going to be spent on how to navigate the scene, how to drop in a light, and so forth. Okay, so what we want to do now is we actually want to attach these objects into one object, but a simple attach isn't going to do it. We need to combine them using Boolean operations. So we're going to go to Create, Geometry, Compound Objects. Within here, we're going to choose Pro Boolean, and underneath Operation, we're going to choose Union. I'm going to click on Start Picking, and then pick our other objects. Once we're done picking our spheres, we're going to jump over to the Modify panel, and we're going to apply a Relax modifier. We're just going to soften the transition just a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now, what we need to do is we need to light this as if it were our clouds. Okay, so for starters, we're going to open up our material editor. We're just going to drag a default material onto the object, and we're going to set its diffuse color to white. Okay, we do not need the material editor, so we close that. Now we just need to light our scene. Now this part of the process can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done with simple painting with light, so basically just putting in omni lights, spots, directionals, whatever to get the look that you want. You can use global illumination. In this particular example, we're going to be using HDRI lighting, or basically image-based lighting. And the reason why we're doing this is, one, HDR images are typically very realistic. You know, they give you very realistic lighting results. And so we can get that lighting result immediately onto our cloud. Two, it's a slightly different technique. So I want to show you something a little bit different. But just know that you can use any lighting method you want for this stage of the game. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we're using V-Ray. So we're going to open up our rendering setup, scroll all the way to the bottom, assign renderer, and change our production renderer to V-Ray. Scroll back up, and underneath output size, we're going to change that to HD TV. We're going to set it to 480 by 270. It does not need to be large when you're initially dealing with just lighting. Okay, so we click on render, and this is what we have. Nothing really surprising here, but fairly simple. Okay, so now we're going to close down the render setup, and we're going to start lighting our scene. Now, since we are using HDRI lighting, we can do this fairly quickly just by going over to our lights. So create lights. From the drop down, go to V-Ray and drop in a V-Ray light in your top viewport by clicking and dragging. From here, we're going to change the type to dome. And then we're just going to do, oops, don't want that. Hit escape to get out of light creation. Render it out. And obviously this is very, very bright. So we go over to our modify panel. We're just going to drop this down to a more reasonable range. So you can see already we have a very bright cloud, or cloud-like shape. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to set up our high dynamic range image, or HDRI. Okay, so if we go down on our light into the texture section, underneath the use texture, we're going to click on where it says none. From here, we're going to just choose a simple bitmap. And we're going to go to some HDR images, or HDR images that were given away from the Dutch Skies collection by 3D World. Now you'll notice that there are actually two images here, 4000 by 2000, and one that is much, much smaller, 360 by 180. Now the 360 by 180 is actually the one we want to use here. Typically when you're dealing with lighting, not reflections, you want to use a low resolution blurred image. Otherwise, if you end up using a very high resolution image with lots of details, you can sometimes encounter little artifacts like speckles or black spots, light spots in the rendering. So to make it easier and provide cleaner, smoother results, we're going with the low res one. Now when you open up in HDRI, you basically just need to set the linear component here so that there is no clipping. Okay, so right around here. And we want to pay attention to this number. So I'm just going to select it and do Control C on the keyboard. Click OK. Alright, so we now have a texture map assigned. And if we render, you can see that the appearance is a little bit different. However, to get accurate HDRI lighting, we need to do something to that texture that we just applied. So we're going to open up our material editor and we're going to drag this texture over into an empty slot. Now we want to make sure it's an instance so that anything that we change over in the material editor will change in the light as well. Now from here, whenever you create a bitmap, the default settings has it looking for UV coordinates. We do not have UV coordinates in this case. And so instead, what we want to do is we want to have this image wrapped around the world in kind of like a spherical way, because that is actually how the image was created. So here's the sun, it's wrapping all the way around, and this edge is the same as this edge. Okay, so the way that we do this is up underneath coordinates, we go to environment, from the drop down, spherical. Now if we render it out again, very different effect. So make sure that is what you do. Okay? Alright. Now the next thing that we need to do is underneath output in that same bitmap, we want to set the RGB level to that number that we previously saved and render it out. Okay, so a little bit darker. Now you can always play with these values, trying to get it exactly like you want. There, I like that. It's not too bright, you don't want to oversaturate, but again, has some nice lighting qualities to it. And so let's just check out the back. Cool. Alright, looks good. Okay, so now that we have our light set up, we need to set up the material. Because remember, a big part of clouds is the absorption and scattering of light that they do. So we're going to create a new material. So we're going to go into our material editor. I'm going to minimize that window. And we're going to use a V-Ray subsurface scattering material. Subsurface scattering is basically a rendering technique that will take the phenomena of light scattering into consideration when rendering an object. So, for example, if you take your hand and you hold it up to a very bright light, so a flashlight or a light in your ceiling or wherever, you'll see a little bit of red showing through your hand. That is the light going into your hand and bouncing around inside and being diffused amongst all the materials that make up your hand, such as muscle, bone, flesh, and so forth. And that's what we want to do here, is we want to simulate the effect of light coming into the clouds and then kind of getting lost in there, or kind of getting diffused in there, softening the effect. And so if we go back to our renderer, we're going to create a copy of this really quick, just by clicking on the two little guys hanging out, so that we can compare the results later on. Okay, and so we're going to minimize that. And so back into our material editor, we're going to create a new material. And in this case, we're going to do clouds SSS for subsurface scattering. I'm going to click on standard, and underneath materials, standard, V-Ray fast SSS2. Click OK. Now from here, this version of subsurface scattering is actually very good. I mean, I'm really impressed with the algorithm that they're using here and all the configuration options you get. And so one of the nice parts of this is that there's a few presets. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to start off with a cream preset, apply it to our object, and render it out. Okay, so it gave everything kind of a yellowish tint. Not what we want, but we'll get things right in just a moment. So first off, before we can configure anything within this material, we need to know the scale of our object. So we're going to select our object here. We're going to right click, go to Object Properties, and it's going to give you the dimensions in the upper left hand corner of the screen, or of this window. So you can see that it's not a very big object, 4 feet, 3 feet, almost 2.5 feet. So further down in the material, underneath diffuse and subsurface scattering layers, we want to set the scatter radius to some value that is close to the minimum width of this object. So right now it's set to 2 centimeters. So that basically means any surface that is less than 2 centimeters thick is going to receive this effect. So what we want to do is we want to bump that up quite a bit. And so actually we'll probably go to about 60. Okay, and if you're ever wondering about conversions, just go into Google, type it out, basically, 2 feet to cm, and it will give you the answer. It's actually kind of amazing. Okay, now also what we want to do is we don't want this yellowish stuff, okay? And so let's render it out. Okay, so that's pretty good so far. And if we bring up our previous one, you can see there's a subtle difference there. Okay, so it's not as harsh down here at the bottom, and it's starting to soften itself out. Now from here, what we can do is we can just change the scale. And so the scale is a global multiplier for all of these properties. So it'll take this effect and increase it. Okay, so see how it softened it out even more. Now the color is actually pretty important here. So I'm just going to make it a little bit cooler maybe. Not quite. So this color is basically the color that gets bounced around inside of there. Now you'll notice that the lighting is very, very different. When you increase this diffusion effect, it softens the lighting and thus darkens it. So if you want to bring that back, you may have to increase the lighting in your scene. So see how that's really soft, really nice. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the back side just to see if it's nice. Okay, this is looking good. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next step of the process. Okay, so before doing so, we're going to make a little clone and hide them. Okay, and we don't need this one anymore. And actually, we don't need the material editor right now. So now what we need to do is we need to take all that lighting that we calculated and burn it into a texture. So we do this by first applying wrapping, like basically texture coordinates. So we apply an unwrap UVW modifier, open up the UV editor. So we see that the texture coordinates here are not necessarily the best, but we'll try something really quick. We'll go into polygon, select all of them, go to tools, pack UVs. Okay, so see, that absolutely horrible. So we'll do a Control Z, and we'll go up to mapping, flatten mapping, click OK. Okay, so it created several chunks. Again, not totally satisfied with that, but this would work. You want to be careful with all these slivers and everything because they can lead to artifacts down the road. So instead, I'm going to go over here to the circle or the sphere projection. Going to scale up the projection volume and go into the editor so you can see it's very different now. Going to go up to tools, pack UVs again, so it squeezes it into place. Go to tools, relax, and just start relaxing it a little bit, just to kind of spread things out. And then we'll go back up to tools, pack UVs. Now if you have a very complex shape, this stuff isn't going to work out too well for you. You know, the spherical method, that is. So instead, you want to use the flattened mapping or many of the other UV mapping techniques that 3D Studio Max provides, such as splines or pelt mapping or any of those things. All of those will work. Okay, so now that we have some nice UVs, we're going to go over and we're going to render this into a texture. So we're going to go up to rendering, render to texture, and if you have your object selected, it'll automatically show up here near the top. So we just scroll down a little bit, and underneath output, we click on add. Now we do not want to use the complete map here, and the reason for this is that we are using V-Ray. And so if you use the complete map with V-Ray, sometimes you won't get output, sometimes it'll crash. It's just usually a mess. The general rule is if your renderer provides an element for anything, render elements, texture elements, whatever, use it. It's there for a reason. So V-Ray, complete map, click on add element, and depending on how well you did with your UVs would depend on what resolution you need. If you laid things out very nicely, cleanly, making ultimate use of your texture space, then you can go with a lower resolution because there really isn't a lot of detail in this particular object or in the UVs. However, if you have a lot of those little slivers or polygons that are floating in UV space, you need a much higher resolution. So for our purposes, I'm just going to go to 1024 squared. We scroll down a little bit further, and then underneath baked material, we want to check render to files only. We do not want it creating any sort of shell material or doing anything with our materials. We just want the file. And speaking of the file, we need to tell it where to put it. So up underneath output, right above where we set our resolution, I'm going to click on the three little dots. Now this is purely a temporary file. Just needs to be somewhere that we can easily find and retrieve. And so I have a particular directory that I use for these sort of materials or maps. Okay, so I'm in the directory, just give it a name. And you want to make sure that you use a lossless format. Remember, we're using this texture to transfer data, to transfer information. You do not want that information to go away due to compression artifacts and so forth. So targas, TIFFs, and so forth, good way to go. Okay, so we go 8-bit color, that's just fine. You can go higher if you want to, but it's really not going to make that much of a difference here. And no need for packing. Okay, so now with everything, we click on render. And so here you can see it's going through and rendering everything out. Now at this point, if you really wanted to, you can go in here and actually use some Photoshop tools to just kind of clean this up a little bit. So get those spots out of there and just generally improve the image a little. So this was the result of our UVs. We actually kind of screwed up a little bit here and have overlapping UVs. So that's what we're seeing there. For the sake of time, we're going to move forward. Just know that you can do this, fix this in two ways. One, you can just clean up this image in Photoshop, or you can go back and try to fix up these UVs. The purpose of the UVs is just to get this map so that we can transfer it on. We're not going to be using those UVs ever again. Okay? So use your best judgment. Okay, so now that we have that texture map, we can close our render to texture. We open up our material editor, and we're going to go back to our original material. I'm going to call this clouds textured. Okay, and from here, we're going to apply a diffuse map. It's going to be a bitmap. And so in here, we're going to go to our directory where we saved that render to texture. Okay, so here we go. We're going to apply this to our cloud. We're going to turn it on so we can see the texture. And we're going to jump up one level to our default materials. Now I should have mentioned this earlier. You probably figured it out by now. I'll make sure it's in the comments. But basically the material editor I'm using here is the traditional compact one. If you're just starting out, you may have Slate active. I like using compact especially for tutorials because it's very compact, as the name implies, letting us see things in the viewport while still manipulating the materials. Okay, so back to the task at hand. Now underneath our material, we're going to set the self-illumination all the way up. And you can see that our texture is nicely applied. Now there are some artifacts, and those artifacts would go away if we cleaned up our UVs or cleaned up our texture. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just basically went through and tweaked the UVs a little bit. It's still a little messy, but this should work out well for us. Okay, so and you'll see how this information transfers. Okay, so now that we have our texture, Now what we need to do is we need to find a way to transfer this onto a bunch of planes. So as mentioned before, this whole technique is based off of a bunch of planes or quads that have a very nice semi-transparent texture on them. From that, it gets all of its color information, volumetric information, and so forth, and then creates a convincing cloud shape. So, one way that we can do this is through vertex colors. Vertex colors are extremely useful for a variety of purposes. So, first thing that we need to do is we need to take this color information and convert it into vertex colors. So we do that by assigning a vertex paint modifier. Going to minimize our material editor and enlarge our screen. Okay, so from here, fortunately, Vertex Paint already provides methods for doing what we want. In the Vertex Paint modifier on the right hand side, underneath Assign Vertex Colors, we can choose Diffuse Only, Keep Color by Face, Turn on Mapping. Click Assign. Thanks for a minute, and then that's basically it. We now go over into our Vertex Paint floater, turn on Vertex Paint, and you can see how the color information seems to be there, but it's a little bit darker and a little bit richer in color. And the reason for that is because our material is still applied. So if we went to a new material, and in this case we do clouds vertex colored, apply that to our object, bump up the self-illumination, change it to white, and then there is all of our color information stored entirely in vertex colors. So at this point, we can even go in and delete our light. We no longer need it. So let's render very quickly. Notice what happened. It turned out pure white. The reason for this is that our material does not have anything in it that says render vertex colors. We're telling it render pure white. So to change that, underneath diffuse, click on the little none area, go to maps, standard, and then down to vertex color. Defaults are just fine. Render it out again, and we get something much closer to what we want. Okay, so now that we have vertex colors, we now need to create all of our planes. So we're going to close our material editor, deselect our object here, go over to geometry or create plane, create a simple plane here. So create geometry plane. Make sure that the length segments are kind of low. We're going to actually use these segments a little bit later on, but actually initially just set them both to 1. It'll be fine. And generally get it to be about the size that you want it to be. Make sure that generate mapping coordinates is on as well. And we're going to just kind of call this cloud puffs. Okay, so from here, actually we'll just keep it the way it is. Okay, so from here we're going to be using a method called scatter inside of 3D Studio Max. So underneath create, geometry, compound objects, we go to scatter. Scatter is now used to take this object and apply it all over the surface of another object. Now, this is one downside to this particular technique. Basically, because we're using scatter, we cannot basically procedurally change this distribution later on. So we need to make sure that we do things right and we get enough density and coverage for this particular cloud to capture the look and feel that we're going for. If we don't, then things are going to be really loose. You're going to be able to see through the cloud in weird areas. It's not going to look well when you move around it. So you want to go high with the number of duplicates, and you want to make sure that things are oriented properly. So the way that scatter works is you select the distribution object. I know the names here are kind of weird. So this object is kind of like your root. So you select your object, go into scatter, and then you pick the object that it's going to be distributed on. And in this case, it's this object. Now you may notice it turned it totally white, and we have a plane up here in the upper corner. By default, what scatter does is it makes a copy of your distribution object and includes it in there. Now, I wish the following steps in this entire process could make use of this instance capability so we could animate this shape and this form over time, but alas, that is not going to work. There are other methods that you can use to get some animation out of this, but it's not inherently set up for it. Anyway, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to hide this big white blob. So on the right hand side underneath display, we want to hide distribution object. Okay, so that's step one. Step two, we want to change our method to area. Okay, so area will do a much better job in filling this space. Next, we want to increase our number of duplicates. So you can see it starts really simple and increases. Now you may think that, okay, well, right about here, this is pretty good. Full coverage, no problem, we're all set. Well, let's go back to our material editor just for a second. Go up to our main level and change the self-illumination so we can actually see the individual polygons. Now from here, you'll notice that we have pretty good coverage. We can't see the colored object behind it. However, when we start to apply semi-transparent objects or semi-transparent materials to this, it is not going to go well. Okay? So you could always test this if you wanted by slapping on your cloud texture, just your alpha texture, at this stage, just to get a rough idea of how well this is going to work. So let's do that. So on our vertex colored material, underneath maps, next to opacity, we're going to click on none. And within here, we're going to just choose bitmap. So map standard, bitmap. And I have some textures for cloud. So as you can see, this image has a variety of clouds in there. And they all yield different results and different effects. And so I actually got this from Max Forums, but these things can be easily created. Many of these are kind of like brushes that you can find for Photoshop, and so you can paint these sort of things fairly quickly. But still, thanks to Max Forums for providing that. So if we go to that and select it, you'll notice at first it's using this entire image. What we want to do is we want to isolate it so it only uses one of these. We can do that by clicking and dragging on this little red box. So we just create a boundary for the one that we're interested in. And it helps if you give it enough black space around the actual shape. Okay, and we're going to close that down. And then underneath bitmap parameters, we're going to click on apply. Now, again, the way that I got to that was underneath bitmap parameters, view image, change the size of this boundary, and then click on apply for cropping it. If we change our material, so it's our material editor, so it's a little bit easier to see, you can see it's now using only one of them instead of all of them. Okay, so that is much better. Now this is something that typically doesn't go too well in the viewport. Now if you've encountered some issues with rendering vertex colors in your viewport, you want to go into viewport settings and make sure that enable hardware shading is off. As you can see, does not work so well in this case. So you want to use plain and simple software rendering. Okay. We also do not want to rely on those methods and render it out. Okay. So it's going to be multicolored and looking a little funky, but we can check our coverage to see how good we're getting. So you can still see some of the colors behind it. That is not good. So we need to increase the number of duplicates. We can change the size if we wanted to, shrink it down, spread them out. And so in this case, we're going to try with about 2,000 individual shapes. So there it is, much, much denser. And so this should work out pretty well for us. Now we can always change the size of these particles or these planes later on, and that's likely what we're going to be doing. So now that we know that we have pretty decent coverage of this object, we're now going to move on to the projection stage, where we actually take the color information from that original object and apply it to these new planes that we just created. Okay, so to do that, for projection to work properly, well, first let's just get out of scatter mode. Okay, so for projection to work properly, we want to first collapse our object into an edible poly, these cloud puffs. Okay, this is one of the parts that is a bit of a drawback. You have to confirm your scatter effect before moving on. That's why it's important to make sure that you have good coverage before moving on. Okay? Alright, so now that we have that, we still have our other object behind it. And we need to select it. So I'm going to hit H on the keyboard. And we're going to select our sphere, which is our internal object. We're going to apply a projection modifier. Okay, so the way that projection works is you select the object that has all the data that you want. In this case, it's our colored cloud sphere shape. Then within there, you pick, underneath the reference geometry, you pick the exterior shell or the cloud puffs, the object that you want the data to be applied to. You can adjust the cage if you want, if you need a little bit more space, or if you feel like it needs to be included a little bit more. And then underneath projection, way at the bottom, we need to add a projection. We can name it if we want, but we're just going to move through this pretty quickly. I'm going to click on Vertex Color, and then that's basically it. Click on Project All. Now we check to see if it actually worked. So we go over to the Display panel. We select our sphere, or our cloud puffs. And underneath Display Properties, we're going to enable Vertex Colors. And there we go. It is now transferred over. We can now actually hide our sphere. We no longer want it there. But we want to keep it around just in case if we have to recreate the scatter effect later on. So underneath hide, we're going to do hide by name and select the sphere. Okay, so now we're left with just our cloud puffs. And if we render it out, okay, so we have a puffy phenomena going on here. Still not ideal. It doesn't look much like a cloud. So what we need to do is we need to improve this quite a bit before moving on any further. Okay, so we're going to move over to the Modify panel. Oops. Okay, and now we're going to change the size and the randomness of a lot of these particles, or a lot of these planes. So we're going to apply an Edit Poly. Going to go to Polygon Mode. We're going to select them all to start. We're going to make sure that our coordinate system is set to local. Go to Scale. And we scale them up. And notice how they all scale independently or around their own origin. And so we can drag this way up, and then we'll render it out again. Okay, so it's a little bit better around the edges, but still kind of rough actually. So let's see what else we can do here. So let's go open up our material editor. Go into our material, and there's actually a pretty cool little effect here underneath extended parameters. This is only if you use a standard map. There's an advanced transparency fall off. And so in this case we want to set it to out and 100%. And what that does is it softens the edges. So here, let's render it out again. Okay, so notice how much that cleaned things up. Okay, so we still have some issues in there. So let's see what else we can do to improve this. Well, we can make this self-illuminated so that there's no shading going on there. We can also make this two-sided so that it does a slightly better job at rendering those faces or those polygons that are pointed away from us. So that is looking much, much better. Okay, but we still have some garbage in here. Now, I found that this garbage often shows up when you have a lot of these guys intersecting one another. Okay, so let's take a look at what other things that we can actually do here to help. Okay, so if we go into our map here, and if we go up to bitmap and we click on fall off, we want to keep our old map, and we want to set the other one to black. So we have our one map up here and the other one is black. So the idea here is that any particles that are facing away from us or starting to face away from us will become more and more transparent. Okay, so this does not look like it's helping us much. So we need to find another method to improve this. Now before we go any further, we want to make sure that we know what we're improving. So if we go up to rendering, environment, and change the background color to something that doesn't exist in the clouds. So say a dark green. And just to go back to where we were, we're going to take this and throw it back up into our main map. So there, underneath opacity, we only have that one. Okay, so notice this hard edge nastiness going on here. Not a big fan of that. So what we can do is we can try using other methods to break up the geometry a little bit, but I found that this is often the case when you have too many objects intersecting one another. Okay, now one thing I want you to see is that that was only with the V-Ray renderer. Okay, switching over to the scanline renderer. Now I didn't redo the cloud or touch it in any way. All I did was switch over from V-Ray renderer to scanline renderer, and you can see that the result is much better. We still have some issues down here which can be resolved with that fall off trick that I showed you, but the cloud is looking really nice here. But the render time also a minute 5. Okay, so what we were seeing before was actually the result of the V-Ray renderer. So if we went back to our materials and tried to reintroduce some of these effects, so underneath opacity, bitmap, we'll try the fall off thing again, and so we'll just copy our color down and render this out again. Okay, so as you can see, we're still getting some issues, and this is sadly common with this technique. A lot of times it can be done in such a way where people won't notice it or won't see those issues. However, they do exist, and it is something that you can see even in the SIGGRAPH presentation. Little artifacts sometimes floating around due to the nature of this particular technique. There is one thing that I've noticed that can help curb this and help slow it down or reduce it, and that is to actually modify this geometry a little bit. So, for example, if we apply, well, let's see, let's turn on faced edges. Okay, so each one of these polygons is complete. It doesn't have any subdivisions to it. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to first do a turbo smooth. And this is when it becomes really important to play with the technique, get comfortable with it, see how many particles or planes you actually need to get the effect, so that when you throw on a turbo smooth, you're not going to be killing performance. So right now we're around 18,000, still reasonable. It's a very complex effect. It still takes lots of render time, but you know, it makes a pretty nice result. Okay, so with the turbo smooth applied, we're now going to apply a relax modifier. We want to turn off, keep boundary points fixed, and we want to play with this a little bit. Okay, so it's going to shrink it onto itself a little bit, but it can round out the edges. thus softening things up, making it a little bit better and a little less likely to exhibit those artifacts. So you can see there's a tiny one right down here, but it has improved tremendously. And so you can continue to relax these guys or do whatever you want to try to get this closer to your shape again. And so you're going to rotate it a little bit, back up, and actually let's try it from the top just to see how it's looking. Because there's been multiple times when using this technique that things were too sparse, they weren't dense enough, and rendering from one angle looked great, but rendering from another angle looked like crap. Okay, so once you have something like this in place, you may think, okay, well, I'm kind of stuck, aren't I? I can't do any more lighting on these clouds. I can't modify much more. As you saw, you can modify the polygons or the sizes of these things, and we can go down here, scale these guys back up, add a little bit more size to them again. Another thing that I like to do is throw a noise on here. Okay, it's probably a little bit too extreme, but let's just see what happens. So with noise, you can still change the shape a little bit, can still manipulate things a little bit. These puffs on the side come from the really big polygons. Okay, so that's not looking too bad actually. Couple particles, a couple issues, and so you may want to just take it and throw it underneath the relax. See if that will help clean up those issues. Kind of smooth them out a little bit, or just reduce your noise effect so it's not as extreme as what you had before. Now, you may also be wondering, okay, well, I can't change the coloring. That's not entirely true. It's not going to be easy, but it's not entirely true. Remember that all of this is coming from Vertex colors. You can always go back to your original object, your original color object, change the coloration there, and then try to reapply it, reproject it onto these particles. You can always do that. Another alternative to that, it's a little bit harder to control, but it could give you some flexibility, is if you go to your vertex color, click on the vertex color box again, and then go over to color correction, keeping the old map as a submap. This is going to allow you to shift things a little bit. Okay, so we can add a little bit more blue to it. And what this is going to do is it's going to modify all of those colors. And so we can say bump the saturation way up. So you can see we're getting a totally different effect here. Okay, so very, very different. Another thing that I like to do with this is I like to increase the contrast. This really helps sometimes if your lighting just got a little bit too soft and too diffused. So this will make it pop a little bit more. Okay, so you can see that the highlights are a little stronger and the darks are a little bit stronger as well. So that is an option for you. You know, you can always use these techniques to get what you want. So I'm just going to get rid of the color correction since I don't really want it on there for this particular scene. Okay, so for comparison, you can see this is the output from Mental Ray. Mental Ray took 42 seconds, Scanline Renderer took a minute or so. And just to go back, let's create copies of all these so you can see them side by side. Now, as mentioned before, you're basically dealing with whatever renderer you want to use for the lighting portion. And then again, you can use any renderer you want to use for the final render. So you can mix and match, or you can use one all the way throughout. Just know that V-Ray has some issues with rendering so many semi-transparent particles together. And so the scanline renderer was 21 seconds, Mental Ray was around 42 seconds, and V-Ray was 18 seconds, but obviously far from ideal. So there may be ways to fix the V-Ray issue, but I do not know them. And if you know, let me know so I can amend what's going on here. So it's really not too bad though. I mean, basically you can use V-Ray for the lighting stage, the rendering the texture, you know, the initial materials, all that stuff. And then when it comes time to render, you can switch over to Scanline or Mental Ray. The downside is that you will have to use, you know, Scanline or Mental Ray's various passes. I really like V-Ray's passes, or the number of passes that they provide for compositing and so forth. And so it is a little bit of a shame that you can't use those, or you're going to get these nasty effects. So if you know of a way around it, let me know. Yeah, otherwise I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It's a long one, but as you can probably tell from my voice, but it's very cool, and it's a neat way of getting clouds into your particular scenes. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something from this. Okay, that is the result. Take care.